With Paradox due to release his 200th EP next year, I think there's no better time to take a deep dive into his catalogue as a pioneering DnB artist and to truly try and demystify some of his techniques and workflows. I've really gone as deep as I can on this one and extracted every bit of information I can find on the internet, and we will be going through this in probably 3 or 4 tutorials now. I've got quite a big series lined up, but if anyone wants any of this information, I've included all the links in the comments below. For anyone listening to Paradox's work, I think the thing that really makes his tracks so unique is the drum programming, and personally I find it so intriguing that someone can make such realistic sounding drums on the computer at all, let alone one from 1989. A lot of Dev's fascination with drum breaks and early inspiration came from b-boy culture, which initially emerged from the Bronx area of New York City in the 1970s.
What is break mixing? Well, what I'm about to do is to demonstrate to you, as the creator of the break mix, what a break mix is broken down into terms. And it goes something like this.
He further studied the intricate grooves and patterns of real drummers to really break down the nuances of how it all works. In order to get a better understanding of Paradox as an artist, I really think it's worth going over a few of his tracks that really stand out. Firstly, under his alias Alaska, he lays down some epic ambient jungle, featuring releases on record labels such as Good Looking Records and Nexus. He also collaborates a lot with Seba, who is another incredible DnB artist, and Paradox would often travel to Seba's home in Sweden and often references the way the hot summers and the cold winters really inspire different moods and vibes for the tracks that they were creating at the time. We also often see Paradox teaming up with longtime friend Nucleus. The pair have been rolling out atmospheric bangers and moody hard hitters since 1997 and now have around 20 tracks on their record label Esoteric Music.
We started it in, I think it was 2003, I think it was. Yeah, we're coming up to number 19.
Whilst Paradox is often veering away from the more common breaks used in drum and bass, every now and again we get to hear the drum master unleash an amen slammer like his track Soviet on Paradox Music. Finally, Dev releases his true b-boy nature with his Wax Break series. Here he creates insanely realistic drum breaks with the intention being that they sound exactly like they've been ripped off an old record. One of the most intriguing facts about Paradox's productions is he's still rocking a Commodore Amiga from the 1990s. This is true both in his studio at home and in his live performances.
And the crux of the engine, 1989 Commodore, complete with tea stains and broken. The future.
The program he's running here is called Octamed, and this is what we refer to as a tracker, and essentially what it is you take the linear timeline of a more common DAW like Logic or Ableton and you flip it on its head, and so everything runs down vertically.
A very old drum programmer sort of program it is. I think it's you'll find that in the early 90s most people started on these kind of tracker system.
Whilst the Octamed can produce a very gritty, crunchy 8-bit sound, Paradox is actually using it just as a MIDI device and a sequencer to send all the information to an Akai 3000XL, which has a much cleaner 16-bit sound.
The crux of it is this is the MIDI controller, and below here I have my Akai sampler, which carries all the samples and the data, and it gets loaded up by the old school zip drives.
Okay, wicked. So now the history lesson is over, we can really start to get into some more of the details and start breaking down his process. To start with, let's go and find a nice record with a cool drum break on it. Now, obviously Paradox is looking for rhythms and tones when he's picking his breaks, but he's also looking for drum breaks with a lot of hit variations, and this might mean slightly longer passages of drum breaks in the tracks. And the reason for this is because it's really useful to have all these variations when we want to piece everything back together later. For this track, I found a drum break by Johnny Hammond, which is absolutely perfect for this. One interesting technique that I think is worth mentioning with regards to sampling the breaks is that Paradox would actually slow down his turntable from 45 to 33. Now this is the equivalent to about 5.5 semitones of pitch difference. But the reason he's actually doing this is to do with sample rates. And by slowing down a turntable and then pitching the break back up in the sampler, you would actually increase the sample rate. And this technique is actually done in reverse a lot in old school hip hop, where in those old samplers such as the SB1200, they had a very limited sampling time of around 10 seconds. So what artists would do is speed up the turntables and record into the sampler and then pitch things back down in the sampler to save time. But what this would also do is, as they were pitching the samples back down, it would reduce the sample rate and it would use the sampler's pitching algorithm. So you would get all this aliasing noise and you would get the sampler's algorithm working it out. So the actual result would sound very different to if you just played the record at the exact speed that it was. Okay, so before we get into recreating the programming and the processing in Logic and Renoise in the next couple of tutorials, I quickly want to just explore the actual techniques that Paradox is using to do all his breaks. Now, I don't have all the answers here, but I have done a lot of investigating and I'd really like to share my thoughts on this. This little clip from Paradox at Sun and Bass is really where I started my investigating, and what we can see here is the way he would cut up a break into lots of individual hits and then reprogram everything from scratch that way.
And if you see here, I have all my samples here. And then you put them together, forms a break. Simple as that.
And in this next clip, we can see how Paradox likes to use the notation view. Now, I'm sure he uses a mix of the notation view and the pattern edit view in Octamed, but from my understanding, you can only offset or delay notes in the pattern edit view. And so in the actual notation view, I think he would only be able to place notes on the grid, maybe up to like a 64th note value.
Break his program in here, and I edit them in notation as well, which isn't really available on most programmers you get nowadays.
Finally, I've also dissected a huge number of Paradox's tracks, and this really involves me going into his songs and trying to find the exact right BPM and then looking for where I think he's chopped his samples and then kind of aligning that to the grid and seeing where everything lies. And this obviously isn't a perfect science, but it does give us some clues about what's happening in the drums. What we can see from this first example is a few things actually. Firstly, that everything is actually pretty close to the grid and he's not doing any kind of crazy swing with his drums. Now this is very similar to the way a real drummer would actually be able to play a very tight groove.
Later on we did some accurate measurements with drummers and found that drummers really can do better than 1 millisecond accuracy if they're really good. That's a mark of a professional drummer.
In this second example, I've gone ahead and compared the Funky Drummer drum break to one of Paradox's wax break series. And what we can see here is that actually there's so much more swing going on in the Funky Drummer than in Paradox's breaks. Paradox's breaks are a lot tighter to the grid. When Paradox was asked on the Dogs and Acid forum about how he gets his drums so tight, he basically said that all the hard work was done on the outboard sampler. Now this bit of information, combined with the fact that he likes to use the notation view in Octamed, has led me to believe that rather than offsetting the notes with hex like we can do in renoise, he's actually offsetting some of the hits by just not chopping super precisely in the Akai. And you can quite easily introduce some swing to your hits by just chopping a few milliseconds off the start of certain transients. Great, so that's really the end of all the investigating and the history lesson, and in the next tutorial we're going to get much more into the programming and the processing, and I've really got a few variations of Paradox's techniques which I think are a bit more applicable to modern DAWs, so I'm really trying to find the ultimate way to emulate this drum funk style which Paradox does so well.